we had seats down the third base line, about a section or two to the right and a section or two back behind where Steve Bartman was sitting.
I was at home.
I was in my fraternity house at Purdue.
I was just kind of camped out in an aisle.
I was in the Redeye offices working on my piece for the next day, and I had it finished. You know, it was done. It was a Cubs go to the World Series story.
It was incredible. The first 7 innings, the atmosphere was unlike anything I'd ever seen at Wrigley Field or any other sporting event. You know, every fan in the crowd was on their feet.
As we got closer and people started counting down the outs, I was like, don't do that. Don't count down the outs. Stop counting down the outs. And I remember even the announcers were doing it. They were counting down to Steve Lyons, 6 more outs. The Cubs are 5 outs for the World Series. Please, just don't count down the outs. That's bad juju. It's bad karma. Just don't do it.
Especially when it got down to that 8th inning and there were 5 outs left. And I remember looking over at one of my friends and saying, oh my God, we're about to be at the game, like the most important game in Cubs history. This is the game that would break the curse.
Earlier, a friend of mine who I grew up with, who was a Cub fan, called me gushing, excited, thrilled, whatever you can imagine a Cub fan would feel as his team's going to the World Series. And you know, I'm really, really pessimistic. You know, so I don't like talking about it ahead of time. But we shared a moment of, can you believe it? And slowly but surely, it just kind of faded away over the next 30 minutes.
And I remember that the 7th inning was the absolute apex of my sports fandom. You know, I thought for sure that the team I grew up with was about to go to the World Series, that this curse, whatever, that we all believed was real, was finally over.
The stadium right before was really nervous but happy energy. It was very, we were waiting for it to happen, and we got the first out in the inning, and it was just kind of building up, and the emotions were high in a good way, but they were still a very tense feeling. Nobody wanted to mess anything up, not saying that the crowd could, ironically.
And then I'll never forget seeing that ball fly down the left field line. Alou's going for it towards the wall, and fans, as fans are wont to do, reached up and unfortunately touched Bartman's hand before it touched Alou's mitt.
Axel from third. Again in the air, down the left field line. Alou reaching into the stands and couldn't get it, and he's livid with a fan. Home run, they throw the ball back onto the field. I'm surprised someone the field. You're a 12-year-old kid at Game 6 of a Cub game, and the ball comes into my area. I'm trying to catch it. You know, it's a foul ball.
I think the first thing I said was, oh my God, that poor guy. And then when we were watching it, I remember trying to convince myself that Alou couldn't have caught it anyway. It wasn't his fault. Alou couldn't have caught it. It was in the stands. And then they had one shot behind Alou and lower than Alou where you could see it just looked like it was going to drop right into his glove. And then I was angry. And I wasn't just angry at Bartman, or at least I like to think I wasn't just angry at Bartman, but it was that whole group, because there were like 20 people going for that ball. He just happened to be the guy that got in the way.
I think almost any fan in that situation would have reached out for that ball. There were other people in the area where he was sitting that also reached out for the ball, and I think it was a lot of bad luck that the wind happened to drift that ball right to where Bartman's hands were.
So I think Alou's reaction made it that much worse. I think had Alou handled it like an adult and just, gone on his way, the poor guy wouldn't have taken near the amount of abuse that he did. But because Alou decided to throw a temper tantrum on the field, he reacted the same way that Cubs fans did at the time. He was frustrated, he was upset, and you can't blame him.
Just being in there and the fear that took over in the stadium, it froze all of us. And in 1 second, I went from thinking we're 5 outs away from being at the greatest game, in Cubs history, to, is this the curse? Like, is this going to happen?
You have to remember that it was 3-0, and there were no men on base. There were no men on base, so you didn't think it was going to be something we're talking about 10 years later.
And I just remember that feeling in the crowd when the Marlins, they scored 8 runs in that 8th inning. And, after that 8th inning was over, it was just, one of the saddest scenes I can remember. It was just, people were still in disbelief.
You were just waiting for it to get over. There wasn't really any hope of there was a small hope of a comeback, but not much. I definitely felt like something supernatural happened, going from, wow, we're 5 outs away from being in the World Series, to, is this thing real? Is the curse real? Because that was just surreal, what happened. It was, the 9th inning wasn't any fun.
Everybody I've talked to since 2003 has come away, who's a Cub fan, has come away saying that they were not affected by that game. That it in some ways ruined the following season for them as a Cub fan. They can't get over it. And I don't blame them, because it was horrific. It was a horrific thing to go through as a fan.
I mean, to see it all disappear like that, just, to this day, you don't want to blame Steve, but you still absolutely feel the disappointment and just the absolute frustration, when you remember what unraveled after that.
I've never experienced, in terms of sports, a moment that was as disappointing. But again, I want to reiterate that obviously I feel for Steve Bartman, and I feel like almost any other person in that situation would have reached out for that foul ball. And of course, when that happened, the Cubs still had the lead, and they had plenty of opportunities to get out of that inning still with the lead.
Probably was angry at Bartman for maybe a couple hours or even a couple days. I don't really remember. But, when I look back on that night, Alex Gonzalez turns that double play, and we're out of it. It's over. We can all go celebrate and go on to the World Series. And if Dusty Baker goes in and takes Mark Pryor out when things start to fall apart, we're still in that game.
I wouldn't say a thing to Bartman about this. I wouldn't bring it up unless he asked me something about it.
I'm sorry, dude. I'm really, 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 really sorry. You don't need our forgiveness. I know a lot of Cubs fans talk about how they've forgiven you over the years. You never needed that. You were a fan just like the rest of us, and you handled the situation as gracefully as any human being possibly could in the aftermath. You could have very easily come back and made those publicity appearances, profited off of it, but you went under the radar. Yeah, I'm sorry, man. I'm on behalf of my 21-year-old self, I'm very, very sorry, Steve.
I definitely feel awful about. I feel bad, and I would tell him that I'm very sorry for what he went through, because I was definitely a part of the problem in the stadium. However, I did not take it any further than that. There were no threats or just pure anger and trying to think of what I could do to the guy after the game or anything like that. But I would definitely say I'm sorry for what he had to go through, because I know, just reading about it and seeing documentaries since, knowing how much he's been, essentially out of any spotlight for that matter. I know how much it probably affected him. So, yeah.
It wasn't his fault. I would have done the same thing. He was just a fan trying to catch a fly ball. I don't think he knew how close Moises Alou was. I think he got a bad rap. Any one of us would have done the same thing.
I would just ask him why. I can understand reaction, but I would just ask him why.
I'd probably just say sorry.
Excellent. Wow.
Oh, you should welcome him back to the city and welcome him in open arms, because since it's 10 years, the people that ran him out the city was kind of wrong, because it wasn't all his fault. They still have 4 outs, 5 outs away from the World Series, so the team could have got the outs themselves. That one play wasn't going to make it or break it.
Cool.
Thanks for nothing. The team hasn't been good really since then. I think they made the playoffs, one more time after that. So that's awful. But at least now we have the renovations to look forward to, I guess.
All right. Thank you.
All right, no
cool.
problem.
I'd say that I feel badly for him. because, you know, most fans instinctively are going to reach to catch the ball. I'm sorry, everybody can say, oh, he screwed up the season. It had nothing to do with it. You know, he's not playing on the field. But I feel badly for the guy because I'm a huge sports fan, and I know if I were a Cub fan, I'd feel awful, but he's a human being.
It's natural instinct.
Yeah, exactly. It's natural instinct. But yeah, I feel badly for the guy.
The atmosphere was unlike anything I'd ever seen at Wrigley Field or any other sporting event. You know, every fan in the crowd was on their feet.
As we got
in a section or two back behind where Steve Bartman was sitting,
I was at home.
I was in my fraternity house at Purdue.
I was just kind of camped out in an aisle.
I was in the Redeye offices working on my piece for the next day, and I had it finished. You know, it was done. It was a Cubs go to the World Series story.
It was incredible. The first 7 innings.
Got closer, and people started counting down the outs. I was like, don't do that. Don't count down the outs. Stop counting down the outs. And I remember even the announcers were doing it. They were counting down to Steve Lyons, 6 more outs. The Cubs are 5 outs.
we had seats down the third base line, about a section or two to the right, and